Welcome to Detail Doesn't Have to Be Difficult. I think detail is one of the intimidating aspects of going about a background, so I just wanted to show you a few ways we can simplify it manually. So if we ever look at this bridge, it looks like a rather complex shape, right? There's just so much going on. So many bits and pieces everywhere. And we may wonder, oh, how do we get down every block of wood perfect and measure out the semicircle and where the support beams are, where the handrails are, this overlapping handrail? How do we do that? Well, it turns out that you don't need to draw all of this detail to recreate this bridge and allow it to be recognizable as this bridge. Rather, you want to try and think about what makes all these brown colors identifiable as a bridge. One part of it is the color. Yes, the brown color makes it look wooden. The texture as well. The shape. The inorganic shapes give it the structured look, the structured man-made look that it has, along with the context. We can see there is context for size. There's some humans here, some bushes, and the tree. All of these are used to identify the size of the bridge because they are so close to it and exist in the same realm. There's also this body of water flowing underneath it because most bridges go across water. Thus, for us to simplify this bridge while allowing it to remain identifiable, we simply need to preserve these aspects. Think of it this way. If I draw this bridge right now, as simple as I can, as long as I retain enough information from the original, this bridge will still be identifiable. In this instance, I've used mostly shape and context to recreate the bridge. But once we add color and texture, it will look even better. This just goes to show that in the hierarchy of information being processed by the viewer to understand this bridge, the shape takes precedent over the detail. Which is why it's more important to get this overall shape correct than to get these bits of details correct. Of course, we do want to add in the detail afterwards, but to ensure that the bridge is recognizable, you need to start big. Start big and work down to the smaller detail. I'm going to break down the bridge into its largest section, this main walking path, and then add on the handrails afterwards. Because the handrails are quite detailed and they overlap on top of both the other handrail and the body of the bridge. So it's actually easier to just have this on a separate layer than to have it on the same layer. To figure out this shape, you can either draw a box or you can just think about it like a box. And once you have the box, or once you get better at this, you don't even need a box, but to start off with, a box is an easy shape to think about around an entire object. And when you have the box set up, you can then compare the distances between significant points, whether they touch the edge or not. So whether it's a point here, which is more obvious because it touches the edge, and you can compare, oh, is this touching it at the same point as my image? Is the ratio of this length and this length the same as here, or roughly the same? Along with points that are in the middle of the drawing. You want to just be constantly observing if all the proportions and the ratios are roughly correct, and that's how you translate the shape onto your drawing. After that, we can start adding some of the detail. So when you're adding detail, you want to observe and simplify the detail that exists. Think about what kind of shapes are these detail parts made up of. Because the texture of leaves, for example, the shadow of the leaves is something like this. You can imply the existence of these leaves through this sort of texture. So how do we imply this layering of wood and the ambient occlusion that's going on in this area? Ambient occlusion and shadow. Well, we want to look at these shapes that we can simplify. You can notice that they are like various four-sided shapes. They have sharp corners and sharp edges. There's some squares, there's some trapeziums. These are the types of shapes that go under the bridge. So even if you don't completely understand the structure of the bridge and you don't want to copy the structure of the bridge exactly, you can imply the texture through just understanding what kind of texture exists in that area. What kind of shapes are in the shadow? And then even if you don't completely understand it, you're able to convey that information to the viewer by recreating the simplified shapes that make up that area. Most of the stairs are actually in shadow, and the point that really stands out is simply the top of each step. So I'm just going to make the top of the step more visible. This is essentially how I would go about painting this bridge if I wanted to achieve its effect rather quickly and manually. The stroke tool over here is pretty good for giving an instant outline to skinnier patterns that are rather complex, such as hair or these handrails. If I wanted a more rendered look and cleaner look, I would definitely go through this and redraw it carefully. But this is going to do for now. I think it's looking pretty okay at this point, but we can sell it a bit more by adding some texture. I'm going to use Select Color Gamut from the Select menu, and I've had it set to all layers, and I press on the brown, so it's going to pick up this brown color. It's going to select anywhere that this brown color exists. This way I can grab a textured brush and only color in where this light brown color is. And I'm just using some random textured brushes that I have. Nothing too special. Anything works really, as long as it has a good amount of texture to it. We just want to replicate that natural wood grain that occurs. And there you go. It is looking quite like this bridge over here, despite being a lot less detailed. And yet, it kind of looks almost detailed because the shapes match it enough that we fill in the rest with our imagination. If I were to keep working on this bridge, I would probably clean up the handrails. So right now the handrails look a little uneven And this makes it look rather shabby and run down, such as here and here. However, in the original artwork, the width of the handrails are very even and clean throughout the entire bridge, which makes it look much better taken care of. However, for the sake of this demonstration, I think I've conveyed my point that even if a structure looks rather difficult to depict, you can break it down and achieve something like this with relative ease. As long as you can figure out the types of shapes that it exhibits and the attributes that are required for someone to be able to distinguish what it is. So the other thing that I want to break down is foliage. There are a few options here. The first one that may come to mind is just to draw each leaf individually. I think in circumstances like this, where if you count the amount of leaves that are important, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it's still doable. But when we get to all the ones back here, do you really want to be still putting them out one by one? It is still completely valid to do that, but there's another way to go about it. Let me just fill in the background a little bit. So for the leaves in the back, I'm going to quickly lighten it a bit. I'm going to fill in roughly the area that they take up. And instead of drawing each leaf one by one, the other option is to draw the negative space. So by capturing the shapes of the negative space, you're able to imply the shape of the edges of whatever you're drawing here, which are these leaves. Because it's the same as with the bridge. We just need color, texture, shape, and context for someone to recognize these leaves. What I mean by negative space are the areas where the leaves aren't filling up. So if I go around here, you'll see that this is where the leaves aren't existing and they're just creating this little pocket of space. And the negative space shapes actually give so much information. Almost as much information as drawing the shape of the leaf itself. It's like that illusion where you have 4 circles with a corner cut out of each, and your brain automatically places a square in the middle even though there is no square. So what we're doing is just taking advantage of that brain power. You don't need to get the shapes exactly right for them to look like these leaves. You just need the shapes to resemble the same type of shapes as the photo. So if we have a closer examination, what types of shapes exist where the leaves do not? There's a lot of bumps and curves, and even certain spaces with very straight edges to make way for the stem, or the stem of the plant. You can imply it simply by having this straight edge in between these shapes. If we remove these, you can have a look at the shapes on their own and just examine their attributes and then apply it to the types of negative shapes that you draw into your artwork. We actually provide a lot of context as well because of these initial leaves that have a little more detail to them since they're complete leaf shapes. Thus, we tell the brain that, oh, if there's these big leaves in front, then these shapes in the back that are the same color and similar shapes must also be leaves. To imply the existence of detail, we can do that through applying some textures. So I'm going to try take some colors from the original and apply them to the leaves. So I'm ignoring the lighting for now because I tend to apply the lighting on a separate layer on top. So I'm just focused on the inherent color of the leaves for now. And then to add the lighting, I'm going to use a linear burn layer and just a fully opaque brush. This is how I like to apply lighting, but you can either just paint it in or use whatever techniques you prefer for shading. So when I put on the lighting, I'm doing the same thing where I'm paying attention to the types of shapes and edges that the lighting exhibits. Because the shadow also provides a lot of information about the form of whatever you're drawing. And to capture it, you do the same thing by looking at the shapes. for someone to recognize this as a leaf, the shapes of the shadows also need to be the same shapes that you see on this side. Although they're a bit more subtle than the negative space from before. So I do use a bit of creative freedom. For example, in the middle of the leaf, I add some lines going out so that I can imply these veins on the plant. To be honest, these shadows are not super strong, so I'm going to dull them a bit, and they're just there to kind of enhance the shape of the leaf, and I'm going to add in the stronger lighting as well. Going to clip the layer. Very dappled lighting, so I'm gonna go in and erase it as well. Give it some edges, sharper edges. Now that I've added so much information to the leaves in front, I need to add some to the ones in the background, because the ones behind now look, there's just a big contrast between the ones that I've just detailed and the ones in the background. So I'm going to quickly brush in some texture to the ones in the background, and they should look a lot better after that. Even just a little bit of picture into me makes them look more cohesive. You can use to enhance the leaves. So for example, the ones in the front, I might choose to add an edge to them. It depends on what kind of look you want to go for. What do you want to really make the focus, and what kind of effect you want for the style. But this is one option, or you can paint the edges in yourself. You can either paint in the edges or add more shadows to the leaves in the background. These are just some options that I would think about if I were approaching this for an illustration. So I'm actually going to mask this because this one's already clipped to this background. So I'm going to select what's selected on this layer by holding Control and clicking on it, and then pressing the mask tool so that whatever I draw on this new layer will only appear within the mask. And you can see that by adding in these shadows, I'm going to bring out the shape of these leaves that were in front. because I'm making the values behind these leaves darker. So now you can tell what's in front and what's behind. Otherwise, before they were kind of merging together. The use of the stroke, the layer stroke here, it actually kind of does the same thing. It adds a defining line, darker value between these leaves in front and the leaves behind. So yeah, I hope that helped break down how to go about foliage. For the jellyfish, I'm going to start with the parts. Some of the parts already broken down. I have the tentacles on their own because it's easier to have them like this than like this, because if I merge them together, it will be really hard to erase and redraw them or get to details behind it and also keep the tentacle intact. So let's say I want to render out behind it and I have to work around this tentacle. It just doesn't make sense. So that's why all the tentacles are separated. Tentacles are separated from the back ones as well. So this jellyfish is rather complicated and I'm going to show you how to render this time. So before I was showing you how to simplify details, but this time I'm going to work into it a bit more and show you how I would go about getting all the details down. So first off, I see that the tail is a bit translucent. So I'm going to airbrush in some blues. And along with the head of the jellyfish, oh, it's all on the same layer, so I'm going to brush in some blues in the middle as well. Then use a transparent with its opacity with pressure. So this brush is set so that the harder I press, the more opaque it is, and the lighter you press, the more see-through it is. Going to grab a yellow, add in these, I don't know what it is, these yellow details. I think this thing is a lot more yellow as well. So we're going to put that in. Along with up here. Any large gradient or transparent things you really want to get out of the way sooner rather than later, because it's difficult to have a smooth gradient through rendering. It's easier to do it at the beginning. You want to set up that foundation for yourself. Right now I'm just looking at where the yellow is most concentrated and where it is a bit more see-through. It also has some cool brown effects in the, I have no idea what to call them, in the skirt. So we're going to try add that in. I really like painting because it's just, you just look at the blobs of color over here and you just apply it. You simplify this into just shapes of color and then get the overall shapes down first, followed by the smaller details that are also just tiny shapes. Add some wrinkles in. You really want to get the underlying pattern down first. I'm not sure what the best way to explain it is, but basically you end up getting better at deconstructing the patterns of an object. So what is the easiest way to recreate this pattern? It would be to get the brown down first, then the yellow, and then finally these little details, little textures going across the top. It would be a lot harder to go from these details to adding the yellow underneath. It'll look different, essentially. It's just a bit, you lose some of the detail that you added because the yellow is going to overlap it. Adding more and more detail is just about paying attention to the little things. So for example, these tentacles, they're looking like tentacles, right? I got the shape down, but what could I do to make them look more like the reference? You can notice that there's actually a subtle gradient within the tentacle. For example, in here, it actually goes a little lighter before it gets darker. And I don't have that in these, this is just one shade. So now that I've noticed that, I can apply a bit to the ends of the tentacle. And then it's just about continuously adding the little things. such as the cap of the jellyfish being this even, actually little bumps. But since it's the edge of the jellyfish and I want it to be rather sharp, I'm going to use a G-pin to get the edge in. With the tail thing, I'm going to start with the larger shapes as well. This is why getting better with your shapes and edges is just so important. For example, if I turn this jellyfish into a square, suddenly it doesn't really look like a jellyfish anymore. It looks maybe like a hole in this blue space, a space monster, or a kite flying in the sky if I added a little string coming off of it. Along with that, a common occurrence with beginner artists' work is that they won't have a great understanding of edges. You need strong edges to imply the shapes that you want the viewer to see. So they'll have weak edges all around. And that will make your subject matter blurry or unclear. Often I'll see people who use too much airbrush. And the reason why airbrush will give you that effect is because it messes up the edges. That doesn't mean that you can't have soft edges. It just means you need to place them carefully because of the way that they can change how people will interpret your shapes. So for example, I can blend out this entire tail here and it will still be fine. People can still tell that it's a jellyfish because the shapes of the head is still so strong. I can even blend out the back of the jellyfish And it's fine because the top part, the top edges are carrying the shape. Lastly, to add even more detail, I think it's quite important to get in some of the texture of the tail. So here I'm just repeating this kind of pattern because I'm looking at the lighter parts of the skirt texture, and these are the shapes that I see. Here's the exercise for detail. So ideally, I want you to find a reference that includes some sort of element that you might actually put in the background of your final illustration. So here I have found some rocks. I want to get better at depicting rocks. The first step is to analyze the shapes. You can do that by looking at them and also filling them in. Here I filled in the overall shape, and then I added some shading following the reference as well, very roughly, along with some darker shapes. So by doing this, along with just looking at the image itself, you can figure out, oh, rocks create this kind of shape. These strange looking polygons with curvy and rugged edges. Step 2 is to take what you've learned and recreate the subject matter on your own. So here I have laid out some rocks by just taking the shapes that I've learned and applying them. The final step is adding detail. So take what you've learned from what I explained about texture and adding more information and apply it to your subject matter. This exercise will help you learn to break down shapes and also practice increasing and decreasing detail. Because from the photo, the shapes that we get, we are decreasing the amount of detail. And yet, once we go through the steps, we are increasing the amount of detail. Okay, I hope that you guys enjoyed the lesson on detail. I will see you in the next one. Bye!